Hello, everybody, and welcome to this talk, which I hope will be helpful to you on staying well in challenging times, especially if you're a postgraduate. So we're going to go to the slides and I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. So if we move on to the next slide, I can tell you who I am and why I'm talking to you. So my background is as a GP. I spent many years, nearly 20 years, looking after students in a university GP practice. And day in, day out, every 10 minutes, I would see a student and try and help them to sort of move forwards with whatever was worrying them. I did notice, though, over the 20 years or so, that I was seeing more students with mental health issues or stress or distress of all different sorts. So one of the things that I decided a few years ago was to try and approach student mental health in a slightly different way. I already had an interest in mental health, but then I started to, for example, write a series of books for students called the Student Wellbeing Series, which covers a whole different variety of issues. And I did a couple of TEDx talks. The one that you can see there is called What I Learned from 78,000 Consultations with University Students. And what I'll do today is hopefully share back with you some of the things that are currently causing students to feel more under pressure. And there will be, a bit of laying out of some of the problems. So don't think of it all as doom and gloom. But then, of course, thinking about how we manage that and how we move forwards. Next slide. Now, it's really important to think about what it is that we're aiming for. So, what is good mental health? When we think about what we want to be feeling or what we want to be doing, it's really important to recognize that good mental health isn't feeling happy all the time, because that would be a bit boring. It isn't very normal. So, good mental health is actually where you feel and function well. So you're able to do the things you want to do when you need to do them. You can see the people you want to see. You can do the work you need to do, your activities, and get on with life, basically. And it's really important to recognize that changes all the time. It can change from day to day or month to month. It goes up and down. And sometimes we need a bit of help to stay well, and that's normal. So we should probably just be a bit aware that we're not going to feel great all of the time, but if we're getting what we need to get done, then we're probably doing okay. But I'll talk a little bit later about what to watch out for, when not to ignore things. Next slide. Now, what I want us to think about is what's going on and why we're seeing, more mental health issues and challenges at the moment. And one of the things that can be helpful is to frame it in the context of, well, what should we be expecting? So we know that if you're ever going to develop a mental health problem in your life at all, it's most likely to start before the age of 24. That, if you like, is basic biology, and it comes from, I like to think of these things relatively straightforwardly. If you're building something, in this case, your brain, from before you're born all the way through till your mid-20s, which is when the brain is more or less finished developing, well, when you're building something it's when it's most likely to go wrong. It can be affected by genetics or childhood trauma or family breakup or bullying and other pressures. So it makes sense that if you were going to have a problem, most likely to happen in your younger years. But if you remember at the beginning, I said that we were seeing more and more problems. It wasn't just me noticing them in my practice. This is happening all over the world. And it is helpful to think about why that might be, because evolution hasn't changed. Biology hasn't changed. So something else is causing pressure to young people everywhere, students, and we need to think about what are those pressures that might be different in the last 20 or 30 years when those problems and numbers of people struggling have gone up. What's different now? And that's what we're going to have a little think about, because then if we know what's different, we can start to challenge those things. Next slide. So essentially, there's been a bit of a cultural shift over the last 20 to 30 years, certain things in our society have changed that could be causing more mental health stress. And I think it's important to recognise these won't be the only things that are causing a problem, but they may be some of those that are most relevant to students and to postgrad students, of course. So I'm going to go through them and talk about them in a little bit more detail, bearing in mind that I will also talk about what we can do to look after ourselves, because it can feel a bit overwhelming sometimes. And the first thing to note, the really interesting thing in my view, is there has been a massive rise in the levels of perfectionism in young people in particular over the last 30 years or so. What do we mean by that? Well, essentially, psychologists measure how perfectionistic people are. And it's a trait. It's like kindness. We all have it to a greater or lesser degree. But what the psychologists have seen is that as they've gone year on year measuring perfectionism in young adults all the way through till their 30s, all around the world, they've noticed that people are getting more perfectionistic. Okay, well, does it matter? I mean, does it matter, or will it mean that they just write a better essay or better thesis? Well, it does matter. And that's because this kind of perfectionism is having some interesting and quite difficult effects on people. So it makes them highly self-critical, pretty negative about their achievements. And this is just a small example, but if you got, say, 95% in something and you were more perfectionist, you'd be worrying about the other 5% endlessly. And that's just a sort of general example. So it's a sort of toxic, negative, self-critical type of perfectionism, but also the sort where you worry much more about what other people think of you, of your work, of your achievements, maybe the people that you care about. So you become terrified of failure, really worried about letting people down. These are the sorts of things that we're seeing much more of. And you might be able to see it. I'm not quite sure it shows very well, but the little black picture is of all those Word documents, and they start, as any PhD student can relate, with thesis, and then thesis version 2, version 3, version 4, and so on. And it goes through until final, and then final, don't touch this one, and then print this one. And it is exactly that, reiterating, never being happy. And I do understand, of course, you'll have more than one version, but the perfectionistic side of people comes out and they're never happy with what they've achieved. So that can be really quite impactful and important. And that's because perfectionism is strongly associated with things like anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorder, or depression, eating issues, even things like self-harm. So what we're seeing is not that you'll definitely develop those issues if you're perfectionistic, but that they can be linked. And just to think about why it might be, why are we seeing so many more people be perfectionistic? What is it about our world and society? Well, a couple of things are really important and relevant and maybe playing a part. The first one is how competitive life has become. So there are things that have always been competitive, like academic studies and sport. But what we've seen is all the fun stuff's become competitive. So we've got, competitive everything from cooking and sculpture and painting, sewing, putting on your makeup, even cake baking, even falling in love on an island. All of these things have become competitive, those normal, everyday, more fun activities. So the pressure is there to win, to be the best all the time. And we don't even realize it's happening. We inadvertently make normal everyday life more stressful and competitive, and drive that perfectionism by doing things like having a bake-off, when actually we could just bake some cakes and it doesn't matter if they're wonky. So it's really important to challenge that everything is competitive and actually not make stuff competitive that doesn't need to be. And then, of course, social media plays a part, and I'm a big fan of social media. I think it's great in many ways, but Here, what it can do is magnify that competitive edge, that need to be perfect, and that comparison with others. So we'll talk a tiny bit more about those over the next few slides, but just to also mention imposter syndrome, which is not helpful for a lot of people. A lot of people get imposter syndrome. In fact, almost everybody at some point. And it's that feeling where you kind of feel like you're just not good enough, and somehow people are going to recognize that, and you're going to be found out in some way. And just to say, it is so common, and it is something that we need to challenge. If we hear our own internal voice telling us that we're somehow not worthy of being there, we need to remind ourselves we are there because we deserve to be, and we got there just the same as everybody else. So my feeling here is, although it can feel a bit doom and gloom, that knowing about these things means that we can be better prepared about what to do. So just to round off some of those topics, we'll go on to the next slide. And I just want to reiterate, if you're aware of the perfectionistic tendencies and you know that it's going to be exhausting and make you feel unhappy or anxious, then you can tell yourself, this is what's playing out here. Instead, remind yourself that we all need to learn from mistakes and learn from failure. It's a normal human behavior. It's how we evolved, and that we can just do our best. We don't have to be the best all the time. And then it's really important that we take those creative risks, because if we're afraid of failure, then we never try stuff that could go wrong, and we don't discover those new, interesting either activities or ideas and so on. So it's really important. Next slide. And just a reminder also that even really famous, successful people get imposter syndrome. It's not just us as we go up to present a paper or do a poster or anything like that, but even Ryan Reynolds and Emma Watson have said in life that they worry that people are going to find out, that they're just sort of faking it till they make it. We're all doing it to some extent. Next slide. This is a little one that can catch people out. This is a bit different. And procrastination is something that happens often because of the perfectionistic tendencies, but also just when we feel a bit overwhelmed by our work. We just don't know where to start, so we end up rearranging our sock drawer, or making sure all our post-it notes are in a perfect line on the wall. So what I would say about this is it's a really common kind of avoidance strategy. We all do it to a certain degree, but if we're finding ourselves doing that, there are a few things that we can just think or remember. And the number one is probably that nobody does that final draft first time. Okay, so it's really important to remember it takes a few goes, hopefully not the many versions you saw earlier, but it can take a few goes. And that you just got to start somewhere, anywhere. And whether you're doing that like on a Word document or literally drawing and writing, you could do a mind map or just a brain dump of all your ideas. Sometimes it can be helpful to do that elevator pitch thing where you think, okay, in 30 seconds, the time it takes to go up and down in an elevator, how would I describe my idea, my thought process? What am I trying to explain here? And if you can really boil it down, that can help focus your mind and get you going. Next slide. So we've talked about some of those challenges and a little bit about strategies to start thinking about how we help ourselves. So what I'm going to do next is think about the really broad life skills, the big strategies that will help us throughout life, that are really important just for general well-being, no matter what's happening. Because, as I say there, life is wiggly, life is unexpected, things happen, and we all know that now, but it really helps to just remember. So there are 4 things I'm going to talk about, mainly focus on. I'm going to talk about building your network, trying new things, finding purpose, and then there's one more secret ingredient we'll come to in just a moment. Next slide. So when it comes to building your network, this is probably the number one thing that we can do to look after our well-being. So as humans, we need other humans. Doesn't need to be a massive network, but just having people around us who, make us feel positive, lift us up a bit, boost us, who are just on our wavelength, share our values, those sorts of things. And it can take time to find your people, your tribe. As you go through life, you will find new people, and some people will drift away. That's quite normal, but always trying to kind of connect with new people to find who we feel comfortable with. Now, it can be difficult sometimes finding those people. So I would suggest that you think about, where are the places that you feel you might meet like-minded people at work, in your studies? Is it at a job that you do? Is it doing your activities and sports and things like that? It might be where you live, or it might be out there in the wider community. And one of my favorites is volunteering. I think when we volunteer, it makes us feel good. It makes the person that we're doing things to help feel better. But of course, it can help us to meet other people who are also good people. And that can be a really nice way to meet those new people. Next slide. Now, my second thing that I mentioned was trying new things. And this is so important. When we try new stuff, even though it can be a bit scary or we're worried we're going to fail and get it all wrong, we actually boost our confidence and our self-esteem by doing this. It really pushes back on that perfectionistic tendency, that need to not fail and never get it wrong, and we don't want to look ridiculous or anything like that. But actually, we need to take good risks in life. And by that, I mean, meet new people, travel to new places, see new things, try new foods if that's where you want to start. But of course, in your academic work, it may be about, testing out an idea, sharing it with someone, and you think, oh, I'm just going to sound ridiculous or whatever. But actually, it's only by playing with ideas, being creative, taking those really reasonable, good risks that we move forward. I mean, it's a basic fact for evolution. But it's also, it can be fun. And even if it isn't great or doesn't work out really well, you'll be glad you tried. I mean, I can take a really simple example, like when I tried paddle boarding last summer. Won't be doing that again because it was a bit of a disaster. But do you know what? I felt good that I've tried it. And now when people say, oh, have you ever done it? Oh, yes, I have done it. Thank you. And I think the thing is, you can just say chalked up to a life experience. So, obviously there are many more serious ones around work, but, maybe don't worry about whether you'll be seen as a success or whether you'll be letting people down so much, and just give things a go. Next slide. Now, this one is an interesting one. We spend a lot of time in life generally thinking about, oh, do I have a purpose? Should I have a purpose? What is my purpose? And I used to get a lot of young people, students, all sorts, come to see me and say that perhaps they were worried because they didn't know what their purpose was. And I was intrigued by this idea that somehow there was a purpose out there and they had to find it. And I know that's simplifying it a bit, but actually I think we probably put too much weight and expectation on having a purpose in life. And actually most people, well, I mean, they might have several purposes, or they might have no specific purpose and go through life discovering new interests and things all the time. You might have one purpose and then change, like, well, I wanted to be a doctor for a long time, and then I became an author and a speaker and did other things. So I think it's really important that we remove that focus on the lifelong purpose and actually think about our daily purpose. What is it that made us feel good today? What is it we're going to do today? And what is that, reason? Because that is really much more important for, human well-being, is feeling like we've achieved something. And it can be something quite small. It doesn't have to be a major thing each day or even every other day. It might be you had a game of football or netball with your friends, or you took your friend out for a drink for their birthday, or it might be that you caught up with your friends that you haven't seen for ages, or you did something, read a chapter that you needed to read. So lots of things can give you that sense of purpose, but I would really suggest moving away from purpose for life and thinking much more about day-to-day achievements and how we feel about those. Next slide. Now, that secret ingredient I mentioned, well, we forget about how important this is, but sleep is one of the most powerful things that we can do to look after ourselves. And maybe, you'll be thinking, well, obviously there are other things too, like diet and exercise, and of course they'll come up in a minute. But this is the one that I think people forget about and perhaps think they can manage without. But in fact, any person up till probably their mid-late 20s is going to need, once they're from their teens, really, they're going to need probably 8-9 hours sleep. I mean, once you're past your 30, you're probably looking at 7.5 hours minimum. But a lot of people say, oh, I get by with 6 or 5, and very few people can actually do that healthily. What perhaps they don't realize is they're missing out on crucial times during the night, either sort of first thing when you fall asleep or last thing before you wake up, where memories are processed and creativity happens and learning is sealed in. And so it is so important to actually prioritize sleep, because it will help us with not only how we feel, not too tired the next day, but actually it helps with mood, memory, and metabolism. And I actually always think those stories of people who came up with amazing concepts and ideas when they were asleep and woke up and the idea was fully formed, it's for a reason. It's how it happens. So the Beatles, John Lennon coming up with the song Yesterday, or the periodic table just appearing fully formed. All of these things are incredible inventions or creations, and they happen because of sleep. So next slide. Let's just think about what we need to do to get good quality sleep, because it can be a struggle sometimes. And if you are struggling, don't just try and plow on your own without any help, because that can be really, really difficult. And there's an amazing website called Sleep Station. It's an NHS website and can be really helpful. But the basic rules here that I've put in, they're about routine. So your brain loves routine. It likes to go to sleep and wake up at the same time every day. And that can often just be the first thing to set. And essentially not really being asleep too much in the daytime when it's light. So yes, it's okay to have a very quick power nap at about 2 or 3 in the afternoon if you were to have one for about 20 to 30 minutes, but you wouldn't want to be sleeping for much more, certainly, than an hour in the middle of the day. When you are off to sleep in the evenings, remember to wind down, turn off all the big screens, maybe just watch a bit of fun TV, something that's not too stressful or scary, or some relaxing music is fine, chatting with a friend, minimizing obviously the alcohol and caffeine in the evening. All of those things that we know really well are really important for good quality sleep. Next slide. Just to throw this in, because it's true that although I didn't see loads of students using things to help, I don't know, what they thought might help focus the mind, or, they called them study drugs. But I mean, apart from the fact there's very little evidence that they actually work in terms of improving the quality of your study, some of them, students did get them through black markets and so on, and would take medication to try and keep themselves awake, so really not healthy, or to try and focus more, I think was the idea, using ADHD meds. But of course, if you don't have ADHD, they don't really work. So you're taking risks, because they certainly do have an impact on your blood pressure and things like that. So really try and avoid stimulants or things to keep you awake, or the other way around. Sometimes people say, oh, they drink alcohol to get to sleep. And again, well, it will make you drowsy, but it doesn't get you into that really good REM sleep, REM sleep, which you need to help you process all your memories and so on. So just really important to try and avoid those more unhealthy, understandable, but unhealthy coping strategies. Next slide. So just to recap, these are the things that help us to look after ourselves. So we're human, you're not a machine, you will need your sleep. Things like diet and exercise and getting outdoors are hugely important. Taking breaks, making sure that you have what I call brain breaks. But, basically, if you're working for quite a long time, you need to have a break. You need to do something completely different, whether that's, listen to the radio for a bit, go for a walk around the block, talk to somebody else, and just have a brain break. And making sure you spend time with other people, really, really powerful and important support. And then doing nice things for others is actually a great way to feel good about yourself. It literally releases a little puff of happy hormones of oxytocin. So when you do something nice for others, whether that's making a cup of tea for someone else, or something major, building them something amazing for their birthday, those things make us feel good. So it's really important. Next slide. I've put this one in because this is just a different way to look at self-care, essentially. If you have 10 minutes, you could look at this TED Talk by Shocker. He's a grime artist from London. He has had quite significant mental health issues in the past, and he talks now about how he looks after his own mental health. And this, he calls it a TEDx party rather than a TEDx talk. If you're easily offended by language, then probably don't watch it. But I do think it's quite a different take and quite a sort of good one to remind ourselves to look after ourselves. Thank you. Next. Oh, there we go. So if you're worried and you're thinking, well, I've noticed this in myself, and you're not sure when to get help or what to do about it, or whether it's something to worry about or not, I would suggest that anything that's going on that worries you for more than, I would say, 4 weeks, probably 2 to 4 weeks, really, if these things were going on for that long, you should discuss it with someone who knows about these things. And that might be a GP or someone at the GP practice where you go. It might be a counsellor or somebody who supports students in the wellbeing team at your university. But if you're not sure, best not to ignore it. And it might be things like the fact that you just feel like you can't think straight and clearly. You might be feeling very flat or numb, maybe angry, irritable all the time, and it's interfering with your normal activities. You might feel your appetite has changed, your sleep pattern has changed, you're exhausted all the time. And then it can sometimes move into more significant things where you just stop. You've stopped doing your normal activities. You haven't got the motivation to do anything. You can't get out of bed, or you're maybe even hurting yourself. And the things that you need to be doing, the things you should be doing, all of those are suffering. Your friends, your relationships, your work. If it's got that bad, you definitely need to be talking to somebody about it. And people like me, GPs in universities, that's what we're there for, as are all the wellbeing and student support teams. So don't struggle on alone if you feel like these things are happening and they've been going on for a significant, 2 to 4 weeks length of time. Thank you. Next slide. So just to summarize, we often feel like we're the only one who's struggling with this, or we don't really know if we want to bother anyone about it, and so on. And I guess this is just a reminder to say we're there to help you, so don't ignore it. Find someone you trust that you're happy to go and talk to. It might be an academic tutor or a mentor, but the sooner that we see people and we can start to help them, the better. I mean, in that sense, that's obviously, good to get in there a bit early. But I guess I'm saying there are confidential services available, and they might be at your university, they might be in the NHS, but you're not alone. Next slide. We do recognise that quite a lot of people feel like they can't seek help, and they don't want to maybe bother anyone about it. They might not realise they need help. They haven't really realised, that these things are affecting them that badly. Some people just feel like, no, I'm going to sort this out myself. I don't need anyone else, thank you. Or they might feel they're going to be, stigmatised, and that people won't take them seriously, perhaps. maybe a few people have had bad experiences before with professionals, with healthcare and so on, and they just don't really trust the system. I do recognise that. I have heard lots of reasons that people say, oh, I didn't come sooner because, and I'm always say, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry to feel that maybe you felt like you couldn't come to us, or that you didn't, think there'd be anything we could do to help. But I guess my message here is that it's always worth trying and just chatting to somebody about it, or, as I said, talking to someone you trust first to say, well, what do you think? Do you think I should maybe talk to someone else about it, and not ignore it? I think that's my key message here. Next slide. It is really common for students of all ages, all levels, to have a friend approach them for help. So if you're that person and your friend comes to you and says, look, I'm really struggling with my sleep, or my moods, or the way my thinking is at the moment, you might think, well, I don't know, what do I do? And I don't know, I don't want to say the wrong thing. So I'm here to reassure you, people just need 3 things. Okay, so all you have to do is 3 things. You don't have to be the professional. You don't have to fix it. You don't have to sort it all out. You just need to listen to them, really listen, believe them, and give them hope. And what I mean by those things is that people need to feel that they're heard at the experience that they're having. So if they tell you this is how it happened, then that's what we believe. You may think, I'm not sure that is exactly what happened. That's not the point. People need to feel validated and believed, and that they matter. And then when we've listened and we've taken it seriously, then they just need to have a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. That feeling that, you might say something like, that sounds really difficult, and I'm sorry to hear you're going through that. I think it can be better than this. I know it feels really difficult now, but I think we just need to work through, what we can do, who we can speak to. Shall we go and look up online who could help at the university, or who we could talk to? And you can support them to find the help they want if they want to. But the key thing is, it's not your job to fix it. They've shared with you, and that's fine. You've been a supportive friend, and that's all that you need to do at this stage. Next slide. My little mini toolkit for well-being is really just these sort of 4 steps. I mean, there are many things that we can do, but I would always say check that you're registered with a GP, so local to where you're living. Make sure you know where the university support services are. So you can literally go into your university's website and type in student support services and find out what they offer: well-being, advice, guidance, if there's a hub that you can go and just chat to somebody, that sort of thing. There are some great free apps out there for students and all about mental health and well-being, and I'll come to those in a minute. And then finally, some people find journaling really helpful. Just making a note of how you're feeling, what's been happening. Some people like to write down gratitude of what they've had that day, what's been good for that day. There are some great planners out there, some great journals, and I leave that with you. It's not for everyone, but I do think that writing and that processing can be really helpful for some people. Okay, next slide. So here we go with some of my favourite resources for graduates. I think first of all, just starting with these apps. These apps are available for all students, of course. So you've got the Distract app, which is specifically actually for self-harm. The Student Health app, which is for anyone and covers all sorts of physical and mental health topics. The International Student app. And they're all created by expert self-care. So if you go into Apple Store, the App Store, or Google Play, you can have a look, put in something like International Student app, and look up the one by expert self-care or Student Health app, and so on. If you haven't had a look at the Student Mind's Wellbeing Thesis website, then that is well worth a look. It's all about supporting graduates. And actually, there's a specific guide as well for PGR students in STEM subjects by Jonathan's Voice, which again you can Google and look up. And then, of course, there are some fantastic, free resources in terms of, if you're feeling bit stressed out and kind of don't know what to do next, whether it's the Shout 85258 text service and there's a real human at the other end texting back who's a trained specialist, or whether you go and talk to your local NHS talking therapy service, GPs, counselling teams, and so on. So there's loads of great support out there. Next slide. So that's me done. I'm going to look and see if there are any questions and see if I can answer any of those. But just so that you know, I share quite a lot of resources and ideas and other useful things on my various social media. And I have a website called buzzconsulting.co.uk, which has my TEDx talks and more information about those sorts of resources and webinars and things like that, and books and so on. So there's lots out there if you're interested. Okay, so I'm just going to go across to the page where there might be some questions. Yes. Okay, so there are a few questions. So I think what I'll do is I'll just keep talking and I will tell you a little bit about what people have asked, and they're all anonymous, so I will be just answering them generally. So someone has asked about diet. How important is diet in maintaining a healthy work-study life balance? Is there, or are there any particular foods we should eat or avoid? Well, that's really interesting. So whenever you look at the evidence around diet, there's no doubt that it matters, but particularly when you're looking at studying and diet, there are 2 or 3 things that come up again and again. One is how important breakfast is. So we start the day well, basically, and that we should have a healthy breakfast to start off. And actually, really important to eat lots of fruit and vegetables. They have been shown to be particularly good for the academic and work and brain side of things. And I think we should probably try and avoid, well, again, studies have shown it's best to avoid what you might call the fast foods, the takeaways, too much. So a little bit of everything, and I am a keen fan of balance in life, but definitely breakfast is important, fruit and veg, and then the avoidance of fast food or sort of poor quality food, should we say. And then the other thing is hydrate. So drink plenty of water. It is really important for your brain. So, okay. Are there any optimal times in the day for study? What an interesting question. If you haven't read the book and you're interested in this by, I think his name's Daniel Pinker, called When, it is fascinating how important when we do things is compared to how we do things or why we do things. So yes, there are optimal times in the day of study and also times when it's fine to take a break, basically. Ironically, the time when people are least awake and zingy is between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. Yeah, that would be now. Hopefully I'm being relatively zingy. But the best times for humans and actually animals, all sorts of animals, is as you go through the morning up to peaking just before the sort of lunchtime. So mid-morning, late morning, brilliant times for studying when your brain is firing on all cylinders. Lunchtime's not bad. Then you have a little bit of a slump after lunch when it would normally be fine to have a little tiny siesta if you were going to for about 25 minutes at about 2. I hope you're not having a siesta right now. And then actually you pick up again later on in the afternoon. So 4, 5 o'clock, you actually have another bounce. So if you're interested, that is the science. So, right, so somebody is asking about, when there are a lot of difficult things happening in the world, it's hard not to let them impact on your well-being. You see them on the news, social media, and how to overcome this. And I completely agree. It can feel a bit overwhelming, can't it? And so, I mean, there's no quick, simple answer because we can't fix all of these different things that are happening that are very difficult. So I think we sometimes do need to give ourselves a break from some of these things. So maybe say, I'm going to look at the news, maybe just once or twice a day at the most, and pick a time of day when you're generally, able to have a bit of a break and relax. You're not going straight into something else, for example. And maybe when you're going to spend time with others afterwards that will lift you again. So that can be quite a good way to do it. So minimize how often you're looking at this stuff. And also to try and remember, you can only control certain things in life. So, the stuff that you can control, that's what you need to try and focus on. And remember, you cannot fix all of these other things, but you can do certain things. So if the things that worry you are, I don't know, climate change and the impact on the environment, so we do things then that help as best we can. You might make choices in your life to improve the environment, or ride your bike rather than get a car or whatever. So I know I'm just giving quick examples, but I think we have to remember we can't control everything. We can minimize how often we look at these things and still feel connected and know what's going on in the world. But I do think it can be overwhelming. And so we do have to be realistic about how much our brains can take in and process and deal with. And we need to be kind to ourselves, really. So next question, a PhD can sometimes be an isolating experience. How can I help myself avoid feeling isolated? Really important. So that connection with other humans, as I said, is probably the most important thing for human well-being, and connecting with others, building our network, finding our people and our tribe is so important. I think sometimes we actually have to plan it. We have to say, right, okay, in my actual diary, not only am I going to do work that day, but I'm going to plan specifically to meet people. I'm going to go and meet, Brian for lunch. I'm going to have see my family or a friend for dinner or a coffee, and maybe each day just plan in, even if it's quite a short break, make sure you hang out maybe with some colleagues if they're good to hang out with as well. But I think the key thing is not let it creep up on you until you realize that days have passed since you spoke to another human. I think we've all done that sometimes, but it's not great for our well-being. We need other people. So I think plan it and don't let it just sort of overwhelm you and suddenly you realize you're just not seeing anyone. Okay, the next question is the PGR supervisor relationship can sometimes be difficult to navigate and difficult to know where to draw boundaries. So keeping well-being in mind. Any advice for this? Well, obviously, that can mean lots of different things for people in terms of staying well when you have maybe got a difficult relationship with somebody. And I know these relationships can be challenging because you don't often get a lot of say maybe over who you have to work with and so on. And we've all worked with people who can be difficult. So I think the thing is to actually think about your boundaries, and if you need to, keep the time spent in contact with them to what's needed and required, and be very sort of clear and simple and polite and businesslike about it. Have very specific things booked in, and address the specific challenges of that interaction, that relationship. Are they somebody who's just not very good with other people? Are they irritable? Are they angry? Whatever those issues are, you'll need to address them individually. But I think the key is to have the boundaries and maybe make sure that the contact doesn't overload you, overwhelm you, bring you down. And talk to other people. If you're struggling with that very important relationship, then try and find advice and guidance. And my suspicion is that if you look at some of these websites like the Wellbeing Thesis, or even the Jonathan's Voice one, they probably cover some of these, challenging topics, because it's not uncommon. I saw quite a few students who were having difficult relationships with their supervisors, and those can be really big issues. But by talking to people about it, they could build a strategy and so on, and that's what's really going to help you through, I think. So the next question is, any advice on how to get motivated when you feel completely burnt out? Well, I think if you feel completely burnt out, you need a break, actually. So you can't be motivated, because if you have reached that point of burnout, that point of exhaustion and overwhelm, you need to recover from. So I think it really depends on how exhausted you are and how difficult things are, but probably there you need to talk to someone about that. That is one not to struggle on alone with. And it might be that you need some everything from time off sick, signed off sick, to discussion with a counselling team about, how to manage the pressures in your life and the things that are bringing you down. You might need to talk to a supervisor about how to manage the workload or press pause on your studies. Sometimes you need to do that. I've certainly helped lots of students to take a break from their PhD studies when they needed to, and come back when they were better. So, I think there you're going to need an independent advice source. And obviously that might be medical, well-being, academic, but maybe several, to get some advice. Don't just plow on if you're feeling completely burnt out. Okay, and the next one is, I find it difficult to cope with high expectations from my supervisor, parents, the scholarship funder, etc. I'm not always sure how to deal with this. Yeah, this is partly absolutely what I was saying earlier about that fear of letting people down, fear of failure, real pressure. And I get that. I feel for you and how difficult that must be. So I think here it's going to somewhat depend on the exact sort of level of expectations. If you need to talk to those individuals and say, I'm working as hard as I can, I'm doing my best, but things are challenging or difficult or not going as well as expected, or I've had to shift the direction of my research, maybe you need to talk to them about that. But I think perhaps if you can be open about what you're doing, how you're addressing it, you're identifying if there are challenges, you're dealing with it. If it's more of just a global kind of, I just feel overwhelmed with everybody's expectations, well, what you're doing there is you're noticing that almost perfectionism or that fear of failure that I was talking about earlier. And that's where it's really important to look after yourself and think about, how you're going to get through this day to day, break it down, make it into manageable chunks, maybe make sure that you're looking after yourself with contact with friends and supportive people. Make sure you surround yourself with some positive people, maybe not look at negative things that are going to bring you down, like overly perfect social media posts from people living their unrealistically best lives. Maybe just protect yourself a little bit from those expectations and manage them yourself as well. So I think just depends on the exact scenario, but I think definitely talk to people who'll be supportive. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now. I hope that has been helpful and maybe given you a few things to think about and to go off and say, okay, well, I'm going to meet a few new people or volunteer or get some sleep, and be kind to myself. And I think you need to be kind to yourselves. You're doing a really tough gig at the moment. You'll get there. But it sometimes takes a bit longer than you think, or a bit more windy the road than you think, and you'll get there. But it is hard. So be kind to yourselves. Thank you.